Welcome back to the Win with 1e4 series. Today's topic is a opening system that is not super popular at the highest levels, but is a very common guest at the beginner to intermediate level, so it pays to know what to do against it. And that is the Philidor Defense. In this video, what I'm going to recommend is a very powerful, trendy system that at the advanced level, perhaps a lot of black players will know how to meet, how to react to it properly. But at the beginner and intermediate level, what I am seeing is black players very often go wrong against it. So I believe it's a great system. It's very easy to play. And well, let's go ahead and check it out. So the Philidor itself arises after the move pawn to e4, pawn to e5, and now after knight f3, black eschews sort of other possible more common continuations such as knight c6 or knight f6, the Petrov defense, and instead chooses to defend the pawn on e5 with the move pawn to d6. The Philidor takes its name after a sort of legendary French player of the past by the name of François-André Philidor, and it's not the most popular system at the highest levels, I believe, because the bishop is restricted by the pawn on d6, and so black lacks the possibility of placing it more actively. I think that turns off a lot of elite players and grandmaster level players. But before the grandmaster level, it's a very, very common guest because it's a solid choice and it does open up the path of the light squared bishop. Now, how most players continue against the Philidor and how we're going to continue, or I'm going to recommend, is to play the move pawn to d4. It's a very natural choice, just targeting the center and forcing black to decision. So they usually capture, and now we recapture with the knight. Now black develops the knight on f6, targeting our pawn on e4, and we defend with the queen's knight to c3, defending here. And we can see from the highlights that once again this bishop has the problem that it's not able to go to c5 or b4. And so what black does is they put their bishop on e7. Now this is an important, sometimes people use the word tabia in chess, meaning that it's like an important branching point from which many different directions, from which the game can take many different directions. Now, the most common ways for white to play here are moves like bishop to e2, bishop to c4, or even this move pawn to g3. But the system that I'm going to recommend is a totally different route. Rather than developing the king's bishop and then focusing on kingside castling, we're going to take an aggressive path and we're going to go bishop f4. So the idea behind bishop f4 is that when black continues with castle, we'll play the move queen to d2. We've set up this queen bishop battery, and importantly, we're looking for queenside castle. Now, one of the key reasons why I recommend to play this way is because although the main move, perhaps the most popular move, sorry, not the most popular, but the best move is knight to c6, and it is the most popular move amongst master level players, in fact, at the non-professional level, the most popular path is either this move pawn to a6, or often they go terribly wrong with the move pawn to c5. Neither of these pawn moves is very good, and that's very good for us if we're going to be playing this system as white. So let's talk about why these moves are not good. So the first move, pawn to c5, looks very natural. It targets our knight, but the problem is that we have this move knight d to b5, targeting the pawn on d6, and moving this pawn on c5 suddenly leaves black with some very serious problems. In fact, most players here realize their mistake and they try to patch things up with the move knight to e8, but we're able to continue to apply pressure on d6 with the move queenside castle. Now the rook is on d1, targeting the pawn on d6, and there's simply no way for black to defend the pawn. So we basically win a clean central pawn instantly. So this is definitely a move that we're looking to encourage whenever we can. The less inaccurate option, let's say, but most popular, is this move pawn to a6. And now, of course, black's idea c5 is a little bit more logical because we don't have the move knight to b5. Nevertheless, we castle queenside. And now, if black does try to play the move pawn to c5, we cannot go knight to b5, but we can go knight to f5. And from here, we still target the pawn on d6. Now, if black, let's say, captures this knight on f5, we play e takes f5, and you shouldn't be worried about these pawns being doubled pawns because you will have the opportunity to use that pawn to create a terrible attack against the black king. Now we have four pawns on the king side against only 3. And importantly, we have huge pressure on this pawn on d6. It's hard to understand or hard to see how black is going to be able to defend that. And if they go passive with a move like knight e8, not only is that a horrible square for the knight and it restricts the rook on f8, but it also allows us to jump our own knight to d5 in either immediately or very soon, as well as, of course, continuing our attack. So this would be fantastic if our opponents play in this fashion. So c5 shouldn't be played either immediately or after the move a6. But what if they continue with the main idea of b5? Now, here, one of their key ideas, or the key idea, is to go b4, remove our knight from the c3 square, and thus leave our pawn on e4 undefended, and then they want to capture it. So very tempting here as white might be to play a move like pawn to a3, just kill off that idea. But in fact, we can go one step further and say the idea is not effective at all. So what we do is we just ignore the idea and we just continue our development with bishop to e2. Now, if black plays the move pawn to b4, we have knight to d5. We jump into this square and we offer the pawn on e4. And this is a Greek gift, and not a Greek gift in the sense of bishop takes h7, check as chess players know it, but a Greek gift in the sense that you shouldn't accept it. If black takes the pawn on e4, the problem is white, the problem for them is that after queen to e3, we're completely winning here because the knight is targeted, and if the knight moves, the bishop will fall here with a double attack on it from our queen and our knight. If black tries, for example, f5, that seems the most natural to me, white goes f3, renewing that threat, and there's nothing to do for black. I mean, black could try g5, bishop g3, and f4, saying, I'll win your bishop, but after we take their knight, they take our bishop, their bishop on e7 here is still hanging. And to add insult to injury, the rook is also probably going to fall very soon. So this would be simply resignable position for black. So therefore, after knight to d5, perhaps the best move that black has in this position is to just accept that their whole plan has failed, right? They have to realize the pawn on e4 is poisoned, and suddenly this investment of time doesn't really make much sense. We have a very strong pawn on d5, and in fact, the pawn on d5 anchors, takes control over the c6 square, and that's called an outpost. And it's an outpost precisely because this pawn on b7 is no longer covering that square. So the march of the b pawn hasn't helped black's case at all. Now, for example, you can imagine if black tries to develop in this way, we're going to be able to plant a beautiful knight here on c6. While if black tries to cover that square with bishop to b7, the problem is we're going to be able to move the knight, our beautiful central knight, over to the king side here on f5 because the bishop is no longer guarding that square. And here we can stop our analysis because the position is very good for white. We have more space, safer king, better attacking prospects. The pawn on b4 is also a pawn that we may be able to pick off at some point in the future. So this is a very common way for black to go wrong. And yeah, so in this position here, we've already seen that two of the most popular ways that black plays, either c5, an outright blunder, or a6, which is just a mistaken plan, lead white to a big advantage. But what happens if black plays the best move? And in my opinion, that is the move knight to c6. Well, after knight to c6, what I recommend is we castle anyway. And now knight takes d4, queen takes d4. We have a lovely position with very well centralized pieces, more space, and we also have attacking options because of our opposite side castling. Black's idea, by having gotten rid of these two knights, is that now their development with a lack of space is a little bit more straightforward. They can play bishop to e6. I want to show just one more path, which is this move here, c6. So in this position here, I showed a6, I showed c5, and I showed knight c6. I also want to show you c6. I nearly forgot this. So after c6, this is another way that black often continues. We castle queenside, and oftentimes black plays the mistake, pawn to b5. So it's again this same idea, but how we should meet this is we should just go f3, defend the pawn on e4, and after b4, now we go knight to a4. So the reason why we react differently to this b5, b4 play here against c6 is because if we go bishop e2 and b4, like in the last situation, we don't have knight d5. That's because black's choice of move has taken that square under control. So what we do is we go f3, invite b4, and now we play knight out to a4. And the knight on the rim is actually not that dim in this particular instance because of the fact that black's pawn on b4 is targeted, and when black continues in the popular fashion of c5, we can actually plant our knight on b5. And the reason why this knight is not so dim is because once this pawn here on d6 falls, we're going to be able to capture the pawn on c5, bringing our knight into play and netting 2 pawns. And this position is really very, very unpleasant for black. For example, imagine that black tries to hang on with the move knight to e8. We have the beautiful tactical idea, again, showcasing that this knight is not so bad. We go knight takes c5. The point is that after knight e8, the rook is no longer defending the queen, and so after pawn takes knight, we go queen takes queen, bishop takes queen, and rook takes bishop, which nets us not only a pawn, but this is not an arrangement of pieces that any player ever sort of strives for. So this is another really good outcome that's possible out of this variation. So this is how to respond to the c6 idea. But now let's talk about knight to c6. So as we were saying, we'll castle queenside. They'll swap off these knights, and now because our knight is no longer on d4, no longer covering this square, they can comfortably place their bishop on e6. Now here we play f3, and we're looking for a setup where we begin our attack, and it also helps that we are controlling the pawn on e4. That pawn is now very well protected and gives us a little bit of flexibility with our queen and our knight, no longer anchored to the defense of that pawn. Now, in this position, black, we're going to look at 2 possibilities. The main move is pawn to a6, but what we're also going to look at is this possibility of knight to d7. So as I'm showing here, the knight can move either to c5 or to b6, transferring over to the queen side, and by vacating the f6 square, the black bishop looks to set itself up here on f6, targeting our queen, our knight, and even our pawn on b2. How to meet this? Well, I have one recommendation that I really like here, and it's this move pawn to h4, an aggressive move that invites black to capture the pawn on h4 here. Bishop takes h4. But if they do so, we're down a pawn, but we have an open h-file and we have huge attacking possibilities. The simple move queen to d2 is good here, and our idea is just basically that as black, let's say, tries to launch an attack, we can go something like a6, king b1, they can try and move like b5, and what we're going to do is we're going to play g4, and we're going to slide the queen over to h2, and for sure, black is not going to be happy to have gobbled this pawn on the h-file and give us this kind of initiative, right? Our rook goes from a passive piece that is doing nothing to one of the best pieces on the board. So this is not a good idea for black. Okay, so that's one possibility. Of course, after h4, they could just continue with bishop to f6 and say, I don't want to take this pawn. That's probably the best move, but we just drop our queen back to d2. And in a sense, we also, in a sense, this is less worry. This is more worry-free position than the other one, right? Because here we're not even down a pawn and we still have attacking prospects with g4, g5, targeting this bishop. And our attack is going to be faster than black's attack, simply because we already have placed a pawn on the 3rd rank and a pawn on the 4th rank. Whereas look at black's position, they haven't even gotten their pawns rolling against our king. So this is also a very comfortable position. So after f3, perhaps the best move is to play a6 and immediately try to sort of start the attack. So after a6, we continue our attack with g4, black plays pawn to b5, and we continue our attack with h4. In order for black's attack to gain any traction, they need to commit the c-pawn. They need to move that one forward, because if they try a5, we can actually snap up this pawn on b5. And if they try b4, we can snap up the pawn with our queen. So in order to get the ball rolling, they have to make the highly committal move, pawn to c5. And this sort of plays into our hands, because we're going to go queen back. I recommend queen to e3, just so that the rook is active here against the queen. And now black really faces a lot of pressure here on this pawn on d6, and they cannot afford to waste time, right? Let's say they play some move like, I don't know, rook to b8 or something like this. The problem here is not only can we continue with g5, but we can also immediately target with e5, targeting the knight and targeting the pawn, when the point is they cannot capture this way because the queen would be hanging. So this is a very dangerous threat that white has with e5. And so what black needs to do is they need to just immediately create threats of their own. So they go b4. They target our knight on c3. And now we have a clever move. It's a really nice idea that we need to remember, which is don't be tempted by the move knight to d5, which would just, it wouldn't be a bad move per se, but what it would do, knight to d5, is it would sort of create a position, let's say like this, where the d file has been locked down, and so we have less pressure against this sensitive, this vulnerable pawn on d6. So instead, we're going to once again argue that the knight on the rim is not so dim. We're going to go knight to a4. But this move sort of has two very nice ideas. The first one is kind of a more obvious idea, let's say, which is this move knight takes c5, right? This is a trap that maybe some players will fall for, but most, I guess, they will see it, right? So if a player gets reckless and they go a5, we're just going to gobble this pawn on c5, targeting the bishop to boot, and this pawn on d6 is next. It's very weak. We're going to have some e5 ideas. Maybe before we play g5, we can chop this strong bishop. So we're just winning here. But if our opponent sees this, probably the best move that they have is this move queen to a5. Not only do they target our knight, but they also sidestep the tactical idea of knight takes c5. So they go queen a5. And here's where our second idea comes into play, which I sort of really like, because it's a kind of a subtle idea that a lot of black players are going to take the bait. By the way, I should say, in this position, there's no bishop takes a2 ideas. In case you're worried about losing this pawn, you would just go b3, shut down this bishop on a2, and just pick it up a couple of moves from now. So this would be a big blunder. But let's say they continue with queen a5, maybe the best move. We go b3. We have to defend our knight. And now this is where we invite the move bishop to d7. Because for black, the attack is very difficult to continue while we have set up this blockade. So it's natural that many black players are going to play bishop to d7 and say, what are you going to do about this knight? If, for example, you go back to b2, now I can actually take this pawn on a2. My threat is queen a1 check, and when your king moves, I'm going to take the knight on b2 as well. So this we cannot do, but here's our idea. So we go pawn to h5, and we just continue our attack. And the reason why this is very strong is because when black takes our knight, pawn takes a4, they really don't have any other way to justify their last few moves, right? Queen a5 and bishop d7, it's all about hitting this knight. So if they don't follow through on their plan, we're going to be even happier than if they do. But if they do, bishop takes a4, pawn takes a4, and now queen takes a4, the idea that we have is not to grab this pawn, since after all the a2 pawn is hanging, but rather to play the move bishop to c4. And in this way, we find, we're down a pawn for now, but we find a beautiful square for our light squared bishop, and we have the bishop pair. So right now we have the bishop pair, we have a lot of pressure against this backward pawn on d6, and we have a huge attack that is already very, very difficult to stop. And the position is actually winning for white already. As an example of how dangerous things can get, let's say that black defends the pawn with rook f to d8. The way we would continue here is just g5, targeting the knight, and after the knight moves, we see the benefit of having this bishop here x-raying the black king. We have the move pawn to g6. Pawn to g6 targets the pawn on f7, and there's just no way for black to defend that pawn. So the whole king side is just blowing up, and at the end of the day, black doesn't really have an attack against us. We have lost this pawn on b2, but it's not a big deal. We have everything covered with the combination of the bishop and the queen. Maybe the best move is to play knight to d7, try and get the pieces active and give up this pawn on d6. I should say, by the way, perhaps you're thinking the move queen to a3 is a good way for black to say, well, let's get the queens off the board, and now I give you back a pawn, And, well, I had won a pawn first on the queen side. Now I lose a pawn on the queen side. The queens are off the board, so there's not so much of an attack. But that would be not a correct assessment of this position. This position is completely winning for white because even in the absence of the queens, what's going to happen is that after, let's say, bishop takes, rook takes, we see that the bishop and the rook are much more powerful pieces than their counterparts. And even though we don't have queens, this attack is still an extremely nasty attack for black to face. On top of this, we have pressure against the pawn on a6, and these pawns are permanent weaknesses. So all of this combines to give us a winning position. So this is definitely not a way that black is going to save themselves. Okay, so knight to d7, they can try. And now we play h6. I like this move. Maybe not the only move, but the best move in the position. We break. This is a different topic to openings, but it's something you might hear me talk about in discussions of different, win with 1e4 series or other series. And it's this attack on a focal point, which means that let's say that black has these 3 pawns, right? Which they do right now. Well, one of the pawns is the odd one out, meaning that it's this one. And the reason why it's the odd one out is because the other 2 pawns, highlighted in blue, are light squared pawns. The pawn in red is a dark squared pawn. And so what happens is black actually is much more well covered on the light squares, which means that our focal point for the attack, the pawn that we should focus on, is probably, most of the time, it's going to be that dark squared pawn, because black is already structurally not very strong, doesn't have those dark squares under as good of a coverage as the light squares. So if we target that one, then we really can create a situation where their dark squares collapse, right? And this falls under a category of sort of attacking along a particular set of squares or a particular color complex. So that's a topic for another day. And so what this invites is the move pawn to g6, because otherwise what can you do? If pawn takes like this, then we go rook takes and we just steamroll them on the h-file. If, on the other hand, they just leave it here, we're going to take it. And once again, same effect, we open up the h-file. So it invites the move pawn to g6, and we see that we've achieved our goal, which is to force that last remaining dark square pawn onto a light square, meaning that we now have a strong grip on the dark squares, and we also have some back rank mate ideas. And only now do we capture the pawn on d6. So we take the pawn on d6, we get this position, and probably what black needs to do is to play bishop takes d6, rook takes d6, and try and hang on in this position for dear life. But the position is objectively winning. There is not really too much that black can do. I mean, I will show you a line, for example, in this position here. If black goes rook a to d8, then we can do something like g5, knight to d7, h6. This is a kind of a similar line. g6, takes, rook takes, and knight e5, right? So we get a similar position via a different move order. And just to show you here, for example, how we could continue, we could go rook takes rook, plant the bishop on d5, and as black tries to sort of scramble back into the game, maybe a move like queen b5, we go queen f4, we target this knight on e5, and when the knight moves, we can already checkmate here with queen takes f7. We're looking for queen g7 on the next move. But if black doesn't do that, let's say black tries to defend with rook to e8, now we've got queen f6, and we've got some really nasty threats here. And even though they can run away with a move like king f8, we can even just bring our rook back, and we don't even need to go after this pawn. We can just bring our remaining pieces into the game, and it's it's impossible for black to defend here against best play. And I should show that even though rook d1 is a good move, I just realized the simplest, the absolute cleanest way to win is to give this check, and when the king moves, we just pick up this knight for free. So I missed this very simple line initially, but then I saw, wait a second. So rook d1 maybe the best move, but queen g7 and queen takes knight, the most human approach for sure. Okay, so this whole variation, none of this is forced, but let me take you back just a few moves to sort of get to the critical position, which is this idea here that if black plays very, very well against our system and sets themselves up like this with the pawns a6, b5, c5, does so patiently, avoids some of the earlier traps, and goes for this b4 idea, we have a very nice way of baiting them into a horrible position by going knight a4. First, we create this trap if they want to take that. But if they go after our knight instead, this is also a trap of sorts, a very subtle one. We just carry on our attack. We let them take our knight, pawn takes, queen takes. And in this position, we just play calmly, bishop c4 down a pawn, but an absolutely crushing position. If black spends time trying to defend this pawn, we steamroll them using our bishop against the king. If black plays something like knight to d7 instead, a little more creative, we play h6 using that focal point of g7. When they move that pawn, now we take the pawn on d6. We get a position like this, which is pretty much crushing. I mean, objectively speaking, this is a winning position. So this is one of the, of course, not a forced line, but one of the ways in which the game might actually unfold. And I can tell you that this whole system, if we go back, this whole system against the Philidor with, in this position, with bishop to f4 and queen to d2 is a system I actually haven't played before researching the video, but I saw some strong grandmasters have been playing like this in recent years, and I can tell you that should I get this position, should somebody play the Philidor against me in the near future, I'm going to try this exact system because I really think that it's very easy to play as white. We have a clear plan. We go bishop f4, we go queen d2, we castle, and then we steamroll on the king side, while at the same time, black's plan is not so clear at all, because if they start pushing the pawns, we see how many problems they can get. If they push here too quickly, we go knight b5. If they defend the b5 square and then push, we go knight f5. If they manage to get a6, b5, b4 in and kick our knight to try and grab this pawn, we move the knight, and if they take it, we go queen e3, right? These are all the lines. If you're a little confused with all these arrows, these aren't lines that you need to try and visualize right now. They're lines that were covered sort of at the start of this video, so you can check, you can replay the video if you would like. But the point is that all of these ways of playing for black, all the natural systems, are actually very problematic, and that's the exact kind of opening system that I like to play. So that covers this particular system. Hopefully, if you've had any problems against the Philidor in the past, hopefully this video will have helped you. Let me know if you do try this line. Let me know how it goes. And as usual, if you do like this content, want to see me make more, drop a like, helps me out. And yeah, other than that, I'll be back with another video soon. So enjoy.